we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Please explain the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, Samarth Pramanik. Okay, so we're talking about the Cold War. The Second World War ended in 1945, and then the world was very rapidly divided into two camps. The US-led camp with its vassals and the USSR-led camp with its vassals. And the Americans, they were the country that first developed the atomic bomb. And by the 1960s, they had about, 25,000 nuclear warheads, including 3,000 plus deployed in Europe against the USSR. Imagine more than roughly 25,000 nuclear warheads the Americans had. And more than 3,000 of these were deployed in Europe aimed at the USSR. And at that time, the Soviets had also, developed atomic weapons. And the Soviets had maybe 4,000 nuclear warheads only, a fraction of what the Americans had. And they feared that, because of the American nuclear warheads and missiles on European soil, very close to our borders, pointed at us, it's a huge problem. We have to do something about this. So the Soviets dispatched a shipment, or maybe multiple shipments of nuclear-tipped missiles to Cuba. Where is Cuba? In case some of you don't know, let's go to Cuba. All right, so let's cross the Atlantic, and we are talking about Hispaniola. I'm sorry, this is not Hispaniola. This is Hispaniola. This is Cuba. Cuba is in the Caribbean region, just south of Florida. The distance between Florida and Cuba is what? 230 or so kilometers. So this is Cuba. And Cuba used to be a US vassal, but then there was a revolution in Cuba and Fidel Castro came to power. And Fidel Castro was a leftist and he aligned himself with the USSR. So the USSR sent nuclear-tipped missiles to Cuba, and these were then deployed in Cuba, aimed at the US, obviously. If the US can position nuclear weapons in Europe aimed at the USSR, why can't the USSR pay them back in kind by deploying missiles in Cuba? So the Americans had these U-2 spy plane program. They had this extremely high altitude spy aircraft called U-2 aircraft. They would fly above the range of any known missile at the time. And they would have these overflights over Russia, over China, also over Cuba. And they would take photographs of what was happening on the ground. And during these overflights, they discovered that there are missiles, probably Soviet missiles, in Cuba. And that's where the alarm bells start ringing. And eventually Kennedy addresses his nation and says that there is this threat to the US. The Soviets have deployed nuclear missiles aimed at us on Cuba. And this led to a period of extremely tense diplomacy and a confrontation between the navies and air forces of the two nations. There was an incident where a Soviet submarine in the Gulf of Mexico, it was patrolling there. And the American warships detected it and started dropping depth charges at this submarine. A depth charge is a bomb that is designed to detonate at a certain depth below the surface of the sea. So you can set it to detonate at 50 meters below the sea surface, maybe 70 meters, 100 meters, 200, 300, whatever. You can set the detonation depth of this bomb. So these are called depth charges. So the Soviet submarine was there. Diesel submarine, I believe, not nuclear submarine, diesel submarine, and the American warships started detonating depth charges to drive this submarine to the surface. The submarine surfaced, and then there was an American helicopter hovering over it at a height of about 10-15 meters, and they started firing rounds at the submarine, firing machine gun rounds at the submarine. Now the protocol was that you don't do live firing on the opponent unless there's a war. So the captain of the submarine thought that World War III has broken out, and he had a nuclear-tipped torpedo, and he wanted to use it. But there was a political officer. So generally what happens in a submarine, what used to happen was that the submarine's captain and his second in command had to agree. Both of them had to agree. If both agreed, they could launch a nuclear weapon. But on this particular submarine, there was a high-ranking Soviet political officer also who was there. And that person disagreed. That's why it did not happen. So the world came to the brink of nuclear war. Eventually, a diplomatic consensus, a diplomatic settlement was reached. The Soviets agreed to withdraw the nuclear missiles from Cuba, and the Americans secretly agreed to withdraw American nuclear missiles from Turkey that were aimed at the USSR. Today, you have American nuclear missiles in Turkey aimed at Russia. So that's kind of what this Cuban Missile Crisis was. The US president was John F. Kennedy at the time. It was 62, not 63. So yeah, that's what it was in brief. It is probably the closest the world came to a nuclear exchange. So the Soviets had about 3,000 plus nuclear warheads. The Americans had 25,000 roughly nuclear warheads. And that would have been a catastrophe if a nuclear exchange had happened.